Lesson 4, Membrane Structure and Function, the Fluid Mosaic Membrane. In Lesson 3, we very briefly looked at the plasma membrane as we were examining the structure of the cell, and at that time we assigned the plasma membrane a role of gatekeeper of the cell. In Lesson 4, we're going to look at the membrane structure in much more greater detail and also look at the specific function in a little bit more detail. The plasma membrane is on the outside, so obviously that establishes and maintains the cellular boundary. Anything inside the membrane is the cell. Anything outside is the cellular environment. The plasma membrane controls movement into or out of the cell. Any molecules, any nutrients, gases, waste products, anything moving either into or out of the cell must cross the membrane. The cell can interact with its environment because there are ways in which the plasma membrane can respond to external stimuli. It's very much involved in cell signaling and communication. So cells are actually able to communicate with one another. This involves some receptors on the plasma membrane. And also, in many cases, the plasma membrane is a platform for chemical reactions. The enzymes that control these reactions are right on the surface or in some cases embedded in the membrane. The actual structure of the membrane is currently referred to as the fluid mosaic model. So if you think about the name just a moment, fluid, that implies that there is some movement in the membrane, and this is true. The membrane is very dynamic, a lot of molecular movement and change always taking place in the membrane. And mosaic implies that it is made up of different things. A large portion of the plasma membrane is called the phospholipid bilayer. We're going to look at a diagram in just a moment and look at the structure of an individual phospholipid in more detail. But in this diagram, the phospholipids are the little blue spheres with the tails. And then there are a number of proteins that are associated with the plasma membrane. Some of these are integral proteins. Integral proteins span all the way across the phospholipid bilayer. There are some others that are peripheral proteins, and these are just associated with one side of the membrane. And there are also some glycoproteins. This is a combination of protein, but it has some sugars added to the outside. So the little yellow trees that you see represented in this diagram are either glycoproteins or in some cases glycolipids, where there are lipids added to these molecules as well. Let's take just a moment and examine the structure and the nature of the phospholipid. Recall in Lesson 2, we distinguished between polar covalent bonds and nonpolar covalent bonds. And this is very important because whenever you have polar covalent bonds, that can create some charge separation and some polar molecules. We are an aqueous environment, and water is polar. And so different molecules inside the cell are going to behave differently because we are this aqueous environment. If you look at the diagram of the phospholipid up at the top, this is called the polar head. This is very polar, very hydrophilic, loves water, and then the tails are very, very nonpolar and very hydrophobic. So whenever you place these phospholipids in water, they will spontaneously form the bilayer, which you see in the middle diagram. The polar heads are going to be on the outside and also facing the inside of the cell, and those nonpolar tails are going to try and get away from water. And so that creates this phospholipid bilayer. The inside of that bilayer, where those nonpolar hydrophobic tails are located is a very hydrophobic environment. And so this serves to partition the cell. Basically, we're separating water. And so we can establish and maintain that cellular boundary whenever these phospholipids form the bilayer and the spherical plasma membrane. This also has a very important role in controlling what can move into or out of the cell. We'll look at some specific types of movement and specific types of molecules a little bit later in this lesson, but only nonpolar hydrophobic molecules can pass through this very hydrophobic core of the phospholipid bilayer. It's very, very critical that we understand the nature of the phospholipid and how it forms this barrier, uh, partitioning water to create the cellular boundary. In addition to the phospholipid bilayer we saw in the diagram, there are a number of proteins that are associated with the plasma membrane. These have specific functions. As we go through these membrane proteins, think to our initial list of functions for the plasma membrane. And we'll see that many of these are carried out by these various proteins. There are some that are integral membrane proteins. They span all the way across the phospholipid bilayer and they form a channel. And these allow very specific molecules or ions to cross into or out of the cell by passing through the core of the channel protein. There are some other integral membrane proteins that we call carrier proteins. These also allow a specific molecule or ion to pass from one side of the membrane to another. The difference between the carrier protein and the channel protein is this carrier protein actually goes through some conformation change. It actually grabs a molecule on one side and it changes shape and allows the molecule to cross the membrane. Some of the proteins in the plasma membrane are involved in cell recognition. Many of these do have the sugars added to them, so this would be the glycoproteins that we mentioned a few moments ago. This is how cells recognize one another. The outside of our cell has a specific set of proteins and sugars, and so our cells can recognize ourselves. It's also very important in immune function. This is how our immune system recognizes foreign cells. They don't have the same sets of proteins and sugars on the outside of their membrane. Other proteins are called receptor proteins. Receptor proteins will bind a signaling molecule. Many times this is a hormone that's going to be released and it binds to the receptor protein in the plasma membrane. Then that receptor protein goes through some conformational changes and will begin some specific interactions or reactions on the inside of the cell. So this is involved in that cell signaling and communication function that we listed previously.